That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
There is a strange kind of power in silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence a network chooses on purpose. The silence that falls over a piece of art when the people in charge decide the public isn't ready for it. For more than 5 decades, one episode of The Twilight Zone lived inside that kind of silence. It wasn't lost in a fire. It wasn't destroyed by accident. It was simply put away, quietly, deliberately, and left there for 55 years. Today we're going to open that door and find out exactly what was inside it, why it frightened the people who had the power to bury it, and why, in 2025, it finally feels safe enough, or maybe just necessary enough, to let it out again. To understand why this particular episode caused so much trouble, you first have to understand what The Twilight Zone actually was. It premiered in the fall of 1959, and from the very first episode it broke almost every rule of what network television was supposed to look like. There was no continuing cast. There was no ongoing storyline you had to follow from week to week. Instead, every episode was a self-contained short story, usually somewhere between science fiction and psychological horror, always narrated by its creator, a former paratrooper turned writer named Rod Serling. Serling wasn't just a talented writer chasing ratings. He was a man who had walked out of the Second World War with scars he never fully talked about, and he came home to an America that was simultaneously the richest, most confident country on Earth and one of the most frightened. The Cold War hung over everything. Nuclear drills were normal in schools. Neighbors reported neighbors during the Red Scare. And underneath all of it, the country was quietly, painfully wrestling with its own record on race, a conversation most networks wanted nowhere near their airwaves. Serling had already learned, the hard way, what happened when he tried to talk about that directly. Years before The Twilight Zone existed, he wrote a live television drama inspired by the murder of a black teenager in the Deep South. By the time network executives and nervous sponsors finished editing the script, the victim wasn't black anymore, wasn't from Mississippi anymore, and the entire point of the story had been sanded away. Serling later said that experience taught him something important. If he wanted to say anything real, he would have to say it sideways. That's exactly what The Twilight Zone became, a way of smuggling real, uncomfortable ideas about war, conformity, paranoia, and prejudice past sponsors and censors by dressing them up as stories about aliens, robots, and parallel dimensions. A story about a mutant child terrorizing a small town could really be about mob rule and authoritarianism. A story about a man who survives a nuclear war only to break his glasses could really be about the cruelty of fate and the fragility of everything we take for granted. Set something on a distant planet, and suddenly a network standards department that would never approve a script about racism in Alabama would wave the same idea through without blinking. For a while, this trick worked beautifully. But there was a limit to how far Serling could push it, and in the spring of 1964, during the show's 5th and final season, he found that limit, and crashed straight through it. The episode was called The Encounter. It aired exactly once, on May 1, 1964, and then it simply disappeared. Not gradually. Not through some slow fade into obscurity the way some episodes quietly stop getting rerun. It was pulled on purpose and kept out of syndication packages, out of home video releases, and out of the version of Twilight Zone history that most fans grew up with. If you were a devoted fan of the series for most of your life, there's a real chance you didn't even know this episode existed. Structurally, The Encounter was one of only a handful of what's known in television production as a bottle episode. A story confined to a single location, usually built that way to save money, but here used to devastating effect. The entire episode takes place in one dusty attic, with only 2 actors carrying the whole thing. The first is Fenton, a bitter, hard-drinking World War II veteran, played by Neville Brand, who spends the opening minutes of the episode sorting through decades of accumulated junk. Among it, he finds a samurai sword, a war trophy, clearly taken from a Japanese soldier during combat in the Pacific. The second is a young Japanese-American man named Arthur, played by a young actor named George Takei, years before he would become famous for an entirely different kind of space adventure. Arthur has come looking for yard work, and at first, the conversation between the 2 men is almost pleasant. Fenton offers him a beer. They talk. It feels, for a few minutes, like nothing more than 2 strangers passing time on a warm afternoon. Then the conversation turns, slowly at first, toward the war. Fenton starts talking about killing enemy soldiers. He tells the story of how he came to own the sword. And Arthur's easy, polite demeanor starts to crack. He lingers on the blade a little too long. He repeats certain phrases with an intensity that doesn't match the small talk around it. And then he says something that changes the entire shape of the episode. His real name isn't Arthur. It's Taro. And his father, he claims, was a spy working for Imperial Japan, someone who may have had a hand in planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. From that moment forward, the attic stops feeling like a room and starts feeling like a trap. Fenton grows paranoid, convinced the young man in front of him has come for revenge. Arthur becomes increasingly unstable, suggesting the sword itself carries some kind of vengeful spirit, hungry for blood. There are no monsters here, no aliens, no twist ending pulled from another dimension. Just two damaged men, one white and one Japanese American, locked in a room together with a symbol of war between them, each one carrying a different, unbearable kind of guilt. On paper, none of this sounds more shocking than plenty of other things the Twilight Zone had already put on air. So why did this particular episode trigger the kind of reaction that got it locked away for 55 years? Part of the answer is timing, and part of it is what the episode dared to suggest about an open wound the country hadn't even begun to address honestly. In 1964, it had been barely 20 years since the U.S. government forcibly removed more than 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry from their homes, the overwhelming majority of them American citizens, and imprisoned them in internment camps scattered across the country. These weren't soldiers. They weren't spies. They were shopkeepers, farmers, students, grandparents, and children, rounded up on the basis of ancestry alone, with no trial, no charges, and, as later investigations would confirm, no actual evidence of the mass disloyalty the government claimed to fear. By 1964, that chapter of American history had barely been acknowledged in public conversation at all, let alone reckoned with. Into that silence, the encounter dropped a plot point that landed like a bomb. A Japanese-American character openly stating that his own father had been a spy for the enemy. To some viewers and network executives, that single detail felt like it was reaching back into the past and retroactively justifying the internment camps, suggesting that maybe the paranoia and suspicion directed at an entire community during the war hadn't been entirely baseless after all. Complaints poured into CBS almost immediately. Some viewers called the episode racist. Others called it unpatriotic. Advertisers, already nervous about the show's declining ratings and rising production costs, threatened to walk. Rather than defend the episode or trust the audience to sit with its discomfort, network executives made the simpler choice. They quietly removed the encounter from syndication and left it there, unspoken, for the next 55 years. But that reading of the episode, the idea that it simply confirms a dangerous stereotype, misses almost everything that makes it worth watching in the first place. Fenton, the veteran, is not framed as some noble hero standing guard against a hidden enemy. He is unstable, drunk, consumed by guilt over a killing that may not have been an act of legitimate combat at all, but something closer to murder. He is haunted, not righteous. And Arthur's confession about his father is never confirmed as fact. The episode leaves it genuinely uncertain whether it's true, whether it's something he was told as a child and has never been able to shake, or whether it's a story he's using as a weapon in this specific, unbearable moment. A way of forcing a man who fought in the Pacific to sit with the accusation that has followed his own community for 20 years, whether or not it was ever true for any individual person. Even the sword resists easy explanation. Arthur insists it carries some kind of spirit, hungry for violence. Is that meant to be taken literally, as something genuinely supernatural? Very much in keeping with a show that regularly dealt in ghosts and curses? Or is it a way of describing something much more human? The idea that violence, once it happens, doesn't simply end. It gets carried forward, passed down, absorbed into the next generation whether they asked for it or not. Sorling refused to hand the audience a clean answer to any of it. There is no villain in this story and no hero. There are only two men, each shaped and damaged by the same war from opposite sides of it, unable to leave the room they're trapped in, literally, by the episode's final minutes, and figuratively, by everything history had already done to both of them long before they ever met. Once the encounter was pulled, it essentially vanished from the historical record of the series. When the Twilight Zone went into syndication through the late 1960s and into the 70s, the process that would eventually turn it into one of the most rerun shows in television history, this episode simply wasn't part of the package. It skipped the cable marathons that introduced generations of new fans to the series. It skipped the early home video releases. For decades, the only way most people even learned it existed was through rumor, second-hand descriptions from older fans, or the occasional low-quality bootleg copy passed hand to hand. George Takei, who played Arthur, had his own deeply personal relationship to the subject matter the episode was built around. As a small child, he and his family were forced out of their home and sent to a relocation camp in Arkansas after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was 5 years old when armed soldiers came to remove his family. He would later describe watching his parents lose everything they had built, watching his father try to shield him from understanding exactly what was happening, and living for years afterward with the knowledge that his own government had decided, without evidence, that his family was the enemy. That experience shaped the rest of his public life. He became one of the most visible advocates in American media for preserving the history of internment and making sure it was never quietly erased from memory the way so much of the era's harm had been. There's something almost unbearably layered about the fact that a story exploring inherited guilt, suppressed trauma, and the long shadow cast by wartime injustice was itself buried by the very same instinct it was trying to examine, the instinct to look away from something uncomfortable rather than sit with it. The silence finally broke in 2016. A cable network putting together a full marathon rerun of the original series made the decision to include The Encounter for the first time since its single 1964 broadcast. No disclaimers, no edited version, just the episode as Sorling and his cast had made it, slipped back into the lineup as though it had never been missing at all. For longtime fans who had heard about the episode for years without ever seeing it, the reaction was immediate. Some were struck by how raw and uncomfortable it still felt, more than 5 decades later. Others were unsettled by how directly it seemed to speak to conversations still happening in the present. Almost universally, though, people who finally saw it agreed on one thing. Whatever had made network executives nervous in 1964, this was clearly one of the most powerful, most quietly devastating half-hours the series had ever produced. It would be easy to treat all of this as a strange historical footnote, an interesting story about television censorship from an era that feels increasingly distant. But The Encounter doesn't feel like a museum piece. It feels current in a way that's almost uncomfortable, and that has everything to do with the world the episode is being rediscovered in. Over the past several years, there has been a well-documented rise in hate crimes and harassment directed at Asian Americans, much of it fueled by fear and misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic. People born and raised in the United States have been told to go back to countries some of them have never even visited. Elderly men and women have been shoved, assaulted, and in some cases killed, simply for how they looked. The exact same mechanism the episode was built around. Fear transforming an entire community into a symbol of foreign danger didn't stay in 1964. It never really left. Watching Fenton's paranoia curdle in real time, watching him look at a man he's never met and instantly assume malice and betrayal, isn't just a period detail about wartime attitudes. It's a blueprint that has repeated itself again and again, under different names, aimed at different communities, across the entire span of American history since. And Arthur's response, the mixture of inherited shame, suppressed anger, and the exhausting burden of being asked to explain or apologize for something he never did, is instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever been made to answer for the actions of people who share nothing with them except an ethnicity. It's also worth remembering how long it actually took the United States government to formally acknowledge the injustice of the internment camps at all. It wasn't until 1988, 46 years after the camps were built, and long after most of the people who endured them had already lived out the majority of their lives under that shadow, that the government issued a formal apology and acknowledged that the internment had been driven by racial prejudice and wartime panic rather than any genuine national security threat. Survivors received a small amount of symbolic compensation. But an apology signed decades later doesn't undo what happened, and it doesn't stop the underlying fear from resurfacing in new forms, aimed at new targets, whenever the next crisis makes it convenient. That's the deeper reason The Encounter still matters, and maybe the reason it feels more relevant now than it did even in 2016. It isn't really a story about one veteran and one young man trapped in an attic. It's a story about how trauma refuses to stay in the past. It gets inherited. It gets projected onto people who had nothing to do with causing it. It sits, boxed up and half-forgotten, until something disturbs it and it comes pouring back out, exactly the way it does for Fenton and Arthur once that sword is pulled out from under 50 years of dust. The Encounter wasn't actually the only episode that disappeared from the Twilight Zone's official history, though its story is the most pointed and the most political. A handful of other episodes were also quietly dropped from the syndication packages that shaped how most people came to know the series, and while their reasons were different, they tell a similar story about how fragile creative control could be in early television. One episode, featuring a young Robert Duvall as a lonely man who becomes convinced the figures inside a museum dollhouse are alive, ran into a copyright dispute after its original writer's estate argued the network hadn't secured the proper long-term broadcast rights. It vanished from reruns for decades and wasn't properly restored until a DVD box set finally cleared up the legal tangle in the early 2000s. Another episode, about a middle-aged man pressured by his younger wife into taking an experimental serum that regresses him back into childhood, was pulled after accusations that its plot too closely resembled an unproduced script written by someone else. Rather than risk a lawsuit, the network simply kept it out of rotation indefinitely. A third episode ran into trouble after a real former serviceman sued the network, claiming its story about a man tormented by unbearable sensitivity to sound was based on his own life without his permission. To avoid further legal exposure, that episode, too, was quietly shelved. And finally, there's the strangest case of all, an episode that wasn't written by Sorling or his team at all, but was instead a French short film the network licensed for a single broadcast. It told the story of a man about to be executed who appears to escape at the last moment, only for the final twist to reveal the entire escape had been a hallucination flashing through his mind in the instant before death. Despite winning international acclaim, the licensing deal only allowed for one single American broadcast, and it disappeared from circulation for years afterward simply because of how narrowly that agreement had been written. Different reasons, every time: a copyright dispute, a plagiarism accusation, a defamation threat, a one-time-only licensing deal. But underneath all of them sits the same basic question that The Encounter raises in a much sharper form. Who actually gets to decide which stories survive, and which ones quietly disappear into a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting decades for someone to finally open the drawer? Rod Serling spent much of his career fighting exactly this kind of battle. He once described his job, with more than a little bitterness, as the art of self-censorship, constantly rewriting, softening, and disguising his real ideas as science fiction just to get them past sponsors and network standards departments who had no appetite for direct confrontation with difficult subjects.